Imagine this.
A diplomatic conflict between two powerful nations, the United Kingdom and Russia, sparked not by territorial disputes, political ideologies, or military aggression, but over something as simple as facial hair.
Yes, in the 17th century, England and Russia found themselves locked in a bizarre standoff that would come to be known as the War of the Whiskers.
A war not fought with weapons, but with taxes, laws, and stubborn rulers with strong opinions about beards. This is one of the strangest political conflicts in history. A battle between King Charles II and Tsar Peter, the Great, over of all things whether men should or should not wear beards.
The story begins in the mid-1600s, a time when beards were a common symbol of masculinity and power. But for some rulers, the sight of facial hair was more than just a personal style choice. It was a matter of politics and culture. In England, King Charles II had a bold idea. In 1660, he introduced a tax on beards.
This wasn't just any tax, it was a direct financial penalty on those who dared to wear facial hair. The beard tax was introduced as a way to raise revenue, but it was also part of Charles's attempt to encourage a more civilized image for England.
The tax varied depending on the social class of the person wearing the beard. For the common man, it was a small fee, but for the nobility, it could cost a substantial amount of money. In other words, beards were taxed as if they were luxury items. While King Charles II was focusing on trimming the beards of his subjects' wallets across Europe, in Russia, Tsar Peter the Great was dealing with his own issues regarding facial hair.
Peter, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, was a modernizer at heart.
He wanted to transform Russia from a medieval nation into a European power, and he was willing to use any means necessary to achieve that.
One of his key reforms involved promoting Western European customs and abandoning what he saw as outdated traditions. Among these traditions was the Russian fondness for beards.
While beards were revered in Russia for centuries, Peter the Great decided that they were a symbol of backwardness and old-fashioned thinking. To him, beards represented the medieval, uncivilized past, and he wanted to change that. So, in 1698, Peter the Great introduced a law that required men in Russia to shave off their beards. But he didn't, he just issued a decree and hoped for the best. He attached a beard tax to it. Anyone who wished to keep their beard had to pay a hefty tax, and Peter made sure that his subjects knew he meant business. He even went so far as to create special beard patrols that would roam the streets, enforcing the law. The beard tax was not just about money, it was about social control, modernization, and westernization. Peter also implemented a more radical step by forcing nobles to adopt European-style clothing and shave their facial hair, while at the same time encouraging the Russian people to adopt a cleaner, more modern appearance. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with England and the UK?
Well, by the time Peter the Great implemented his beard tax, King Charles II's beard tax had already been in place for several decades. The English king's tax on facial hair was seen as a quirky, if somewhat irritating, bit of policy.
But Peter's approach was a whole different story. He was far more forceful and ideological in his attempts to stamp out beards altogether.
As a result, the two monarchs, Charles II and Peter the Great, were unknowingly caught in an international, cultural clash over facial hair.
While Charles's tax was more about raising money for the monarchy, Peter's was about forcing his people to abandon old ways and embrace the new, modern European ideals.
But what truly made this situation even stranger was the fact that both monarchs held such strong opinions on facial hair that they were willing to implement taxes and laws to make sure their subjects adhered to their visions.
Despite the fact that both kings were determined to reshape the image of their people through facial hair laws, their approaches were vastly different. Charles II's tax was short-lived, fading out after a few years.
By the time Peter the Great's law took effect, it was a highly controversial policy, and the beard patrols were met with significant resistance from Russian peasants who deeply resented the idea of having to shave their beards for the sake of modernization.
In the end, while Charles II's beard tax didn't last long,
Peter the Great's law remained in place until his death in 1725. Even after his reign, the tradition of beards continued in Russia for some time, despite the laws that sought to stamp them out.
The War of the Whiskers may have been short-lived, but it was a bizarre and fascinating chapter in history.
Both King Charles II and Tsar Peter the Great used facial hair to symbolize something much bigger: the clash between tradition and modernity, the desire to reshape society in their own image, and the lengths to which these leaders would go to control the appearance and behavior of their people.
In the end, their fight over beards might seem trivial, but it is a reminder of how something as simple as facial hair can become a battleground for ideas, culture, and power.